better unmute my microphone or nobody's going to hear anything I say. Just going through some last minute setup routines here. Nice to see I've already got some folks in the chat room. How are you guys doing today? Everybody excited about the latest release of Blazor? That's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it because I think everybody's kind of jumping on the stream. So the latest news is Blazor 090 is out, and this piggybacks off of all of the updates in Razer Components, which comes with ASP.NET Core 3.0, Preview 3. So we got a lot of stuff to talk about today. Normally I'd highlight some community projects right about now, but considering that the new bits shipped hot, like pretty much late afternoon US time, I think everybody's probably upgrading their projects and finding some breaking changes and working through things. So I'll get into some community projects next week. I know there's a couple folks out there that have some cool stuff they've shared with me already, and I planned on getting to that this week, but with all these changes inbound, I don't want to have to kind of work through those issues. I know they'll figure those out, and we'll be able to highlight them next week in their full glory. Let's just say that. Don't want to make it look like there's bugs when there aren't really bugs. It's just, growing pains. So we'll do that soon. So right now we're going to go through some of the Preview 3 bullet points. We'll jump into some demos. I've got a project that I need to migrate over, which will lead me into some more discussions on future shows and what we might be doing. I've got a pretty interesting project I'm working on that I'd like to share with the Twitch audience while I build it. So that might be something that I'm going to do later. So let's jump in. This just came out. This was Thursday night or Wednesday night and into Thursday. We got the Preview 3 update and lots of Razer component updates. One of the ones that I've been waiting for is this Razer extension. I know it's kind of sketchy right now how this is working with the Visual Studio environment, but they needed to differentiate the Razer CSHTML extension and the Razer Components extension. So instead of having a .cshtml file for Razer Components, now we're going to have this .razer file. And one of the big reasons for that .razer extension is because Razer's handled differently in Razer Components. So if you've been working with Blazor for any length of time, you probably know that the Razer Components, thank you Streetwise Herrick for following the show. Appreciate you jumping aboard. So the Razer extension clears up some confusion about how Razer's handled versus Razer Components. Traditional Razer or CSHTML, it basically takes C# code and turns it into a string. It's really a generalization, probably an overgeneralization of it, but it turns your code into a string, which represents HTML. Razer Components are completely different. Instead of just taking your code and parsing out a string from it, it will take your HTML markup and your Razer markup and compile a CSS class or generate a CSS class based on that code. So Razer Components are completely different in that respect. So they use the same markup syntax and whatnot, but the output that is generated behind the scenes is much, much different. So they're separating Razer Components from traditional Razer by changing this file extension. So it's a welcome change for me. I've heard there's some little growing pains with Visual Studio. For example, there's no way to create a Razer file yet, so you kind of just have to manually rename files and things. I'm sure they'll work through that soon. This is just the first iteration of this, and it's a preview, so I'm sure they'll improve that with time. So we'll give that a look. Endpoint routing integration, I haven't looked at that one. We'll have to read on to figure out what exactly that means. I haven't looked into that one yet. Pre-rendering has gotten quite a bit of a update. So one of the big features with pre-rendering out of the gate is that Razer component apps, so server-side hosted apps, will begin with a pre-rendered state. So there's not going to be that loading screen shipped across the wire first. It's rendered on the server, an HTML page comes down the wire, and your app just starts working. So it's immediately pre-rendered out of the box, which is really cool for SEO and all kinds of other scenarios. So there's some updates around that. I saw those in the source code a couple weeks ago. They were working on that stuff, so it was expected and exciting to see that we're getting more updates on that. I'd like to see a lot of that come over to the Blazor side of things, and we'll see what happens with the Blazor thing soon. So Razer Components in class libraries, can't say I know a whole lot about how that's going to work. It's not compatible with Blazor at this time, so I haven't really checked that out yet. Not to mention it's only like a day old release, so I haven't been able to jump through all of these things yet. We'll do some of them here on the show in a moment. Improved event handling, and we'll have to look into that one some more. And forms and validation, that's a big deal. I didn't expect it to come this quick. I didn't notice it was in the roadmap. I just kind of overlooked that. But I'm excited to see that. We'll demo some of that today and see how it works out. I did notice that they chose to use the data annotations for validation and forms, which is a fantastic choice. I know we talked about validation on the show in the past, and we discussed like fluent validation, and it was kind of the only option at the time. But folks seem to really want the data annotations support in Blazor and Razer Components. So it's a great choice by the team to make that. I like the fluent validations myself, but people really like their data annotations. So it's good to see that they have support for it there. So let's scroll down a little bit. I want to check out what exactly endpoint routing is, because I'm not too knowledgeable on that one, and what they improved on event handling, because I didn't get to read through on that yet. And then we'll jump over to the Blazor side of things and see what the updates are there. Let's see. So Razer Components are now integrated to ASP.NET Core's new endpoint routing system. So I'm not sure what effect this has on applications yet. So maybe this gets rid of the app component. I'm not quite sure. Or maybe this is what they piggyback off of pre-rendering with. So this is possibly how we're integrating Razer Components with MVC and Razer Pages, is through this endpoint routing integration. It looks like Map Component Hub, probably, yeah, Map Razer Pages, Map Component Hub. This is all probably support for backwards compatibility with Razer Pages and MVC. So this is what essentially gives you, after you pre-render a component in MVC or Razer Pages, you get interactivity now. So with this Map Component Hub, I'm assuming we're spinning up a SignalR service that handles the Razer Components interactivity in your application. So I'm assuming that's what that is. So that will be an awesome change. The whole compatibility with MVC and Razer Pages intrigues me, because I think it gives people a migration path from traditional MVC to Razer Components. And anytime you have a good migration path like that, it helps sell the future framework. We saw the same thing happen with Angular and AngularJS and Angular 2. Eventually, AngularJS got features that helped kind of bridge the gap and make the transition between one framework and the other a bit smoother. So I see that being the same type of vehicle to move this from one framework to another. So good stuff there. The pre-rendering, I talked about this a little bit. And they go on to talk about, this makes a big difference on slower connections. It makes your applications crawlable by search engines. It's just a better overall experience all the way around to have your application start up without a loading screen. I don't think anybody would argue against that experience. Let's see. Razer Components and class libraries. This Razer Components and class libraries. Now, there's only one place I've seen Razer class libraries really utilized well, and that is with ASP.NET Identity. So Identity ships as a Razer class library. So I'm wondering if support for Razer class libraries is the first foot in the door for getting Identity back into Razer Components app. So there's no official support for Identity yet. You can do authorization and authentication. We talked about that on the show before. If you missed those shows, you can find those on YouTube. I'll put some links up later for the YouTube channel. But the identity system that comes with ASP.NET MVC and Razer Pages, that hasn't been fully integrated into Razer Components and Blazor yet. So I'm wondering if this is the introduction, the first step that was required to build that foundation to allow that to happen. Because now they can ship a Razer class library that has Razer Components and Razer Pages and MVC views and all those things, and use the parts of that class library that are required for identity. So we'll see. I haven't talked to folks in the community that have used Razer class libraries extensively. The only real place I've seen that fully utilized, like I said, is in authentication or in identity. Hello, Mr. McGew. Welcome back to the show. We got quite a few regulars in the chat room. Appreciate everybody coming back. Goran and Chris, Santi, and Mr. Magoo there. Mr. Magoo, we'll have to highlight that thing that you've been working on with CSS and in embedding your CSS inside of projects and stuff when this whole wave of 090 kind of evens out to where there aren't breaking changes and things that we're working through. So we'll have to highlight that next week if you can get those little bugs fixed that were popping up. So improved event handling. This new event callback. I've actually experienced a little bit of this event callback. So if you are working on a project, you fixed those issues, Mr. Magoo. Awesome. I have to try that out this weekend so we can talk about it on the show next week. I think it's a really cool idea from what I was reading on Twitter and in the Getter chat. It's a unique way of embedding your CSS, so we'll have to take a look at that. I know that's something that people have been asking for, so it's cool to see you spearheaded a solution for that. This event callback thing, if you are working on a Blazor project and you see some error come up that says something about event callback, that means you are probably mixing two different versions of Razer Components and .NET together. So you probably have a template from one version and it's trying to call outdated libraries. So just make sure all of your templates are up to date if you see this event callback thing throwing an error, because this is a new feature. And I haven't quite dove into how it helps exactly. I think it helps make delegates for components a bit easier. I did notice something in here about when you're using this new event callback, it automatically calls StateHasChanged. So before, when we were handling events manually, every event had to be wired up with a state has changed at the end to make sure the component re-rendered. And this looks like a little bit of a utility to wrap around this action. Instead of calling an action, we're calling an event callback, so it handles some more things manually. So just kind of a little bit of a wrapper around an action. So it looks like good stuff there. We'll have to test that one out and see how that works. And then forms and validation, we'll go ahead and just jump into a demo on this one because I think there's something that most people want to see how it works. So we'll come back to this pretty quickly. So Mr. Magoo says there's loads of bugs to play with in Preview 3. So I haven't really played with Preview 3 much, so I'm sure we'll bump into some of those as we mess around here on the show today. Let's go ahead and talk about Blazor 090. I don't think there's a lot of changes. Most of those changes are in Razer Components, and then they get by kind of inheritance, I guess they get brought into Blazor. So if you've heard of Blazor before and you're not familiar with Razer Components, they've extracted the component model out of Blazor. So Blazor now is more of a framework for handling WebAssembly and loading .NET into WebAssembly and allowing us to run Razer Components on the client. So Blazor's kind of turned into more of a SPA framework for the front end to run on the client, rather than we're not running Blazor on the server anymore. That kind of terminology is outdated. Razer Components runs on the server, and Razer Components runs on the client through Blazor. So that's the way to look at it now. So whenever Razer Components gets updated, that means Blazor gets updated too. So you're not going to see as long of a list of features in the Blazor announcement as you do in the Razer Components announcement. And then everything that is announced in Razer Components is going to overlap, like in improved event handling and forms and validation. Those get filtered down to Blazor. So we've got the same exact updates. So that's not going to be real in depth. Hello, Lapusa. How are you doing? Welcome to the show. Lapusa, if you're not following him on Twitter, I suggest you do so. He's got lots of amazing examples out there. Some real outside the box stuff. Mr. Magoo as well. Those guys are just hacking away at all kinds of crazy demos all the time. So it's great to have you all in the chat room to chime in when things go wrong, because I know you guys have been putting this stuff through its paces. So let's go ahead and jump into Visual Studio. Let's new up something. Let's check out forms validation, because I think that's a good way to kind of start, and then we can mess around with some other stuff. I've got a project to upgrade and talk about some future shows that may deal with that project. So let's get into Visual Studio here. Let's do File, New Project, and let's talk about installation real quick for people that may not have installed this stuff already. If you're going to be doing this after the show or following along, make sure you go update all of your bits. So ASP.NET Core Preview 3, make sure you go in, let's see, I know this is linked in here somewhere. Yeah, get started. Make sure you install the SDK. Make sure you have Visual Studio 2019 and it's updated to the latest preview. So this is preview 4 of Visual Studio 2019 and preview 3 of ASP.NET Core. Make sure you have those all updated before you begin. And then on the Blazor side of things, this just came out. So if you see that error I was talking about, that's something about the event callback missing, make sure you go and update your Blazor extension from the Visual Studio Marketplace and the Blazor templates from the command line. So there's a couple places you need to update there. Just .NET new, just copy paste this into your console. I've already done that, and I've already updated my plugin extension rather for Blazor. So I can do an ASP.NET Core web application. Hit next. We're gonna let's see. We're gonna do some Blazor validation. I don't want any namespace collisions. Let's rename this. Exploring validation, I'll call it. Let's put this in another directory. I've really mucked up my repos directory, so I've created a new one for the show. I've got so many files in here now. So we'll put this under a proper directory, and we should get a Blazor selection on our file new dialog. No version numbers are shown for the version of Blazor in here. I really wish there was something that would kind of identify what version of these tools we're using. It does not do that. It does tell us we're working with ASP.NET Core 3.0. I bet you have a lot of projects, Mr. Magoo. I know I've got, besides just the Blazor stuff, I've got a million projects under that folder, and I've lost the capacity to find things. So we can start this one up. I really wish there was some version number or something so we could tell what version of Blazor we're kicking off here. But let's go ahead and do a create, and I will show where you can look and tell what version of Blazor you spun up. Once you get it up, in case you have problems, you can go troubleshoot what's happening. As this thing moves, it moves pretty quick. I think we're seeing about an update a month. So an update of ASP.NET Core Preview each month, and we're also seeing an update of Blazor each month. That comes pretty much the day after. And if you're following along with any of the Telerik stuff, which I appreciate it if you do, we're updating about the Monday or Tuesday after those changes. So you're seeing about 2 to 3 updates a week or a month coming from your tooling, and it's a lot to keep up with. So if you want to make sure you're not behind and you're on the latest version, what you can do is come into your project and right click and do an edit CS proj. And when this comes up, just double check your version numbers in here. So I've got a package reference to Blazor version 0.90 preview 3. So we're on the correct version. Yesterday, the tooling wasn't updated, and I was getting Blazor 0.8 projects and getting errors because it was clashing with the Razer Components updates. So another thing you need to look at is under your menu up here. If you click under Extensions, Manage Extensions, there is a Blazor extension that has a version number of its own. You can check the release notes on this to make sure it is up to date. So now it's on 0.90, and this is what gives you the file new project templates for Blazor within Visual Studio. So make sure this guy's completely up to date. It should automatically update. There's a checkbox here to update automatically. So it says automatically update this extension. Make sure it's checked. There is a little bit of a lag behind on this. So the command line templates were available first. The release for the extension came a few hours after. So there was a little bit of a lag between there, which was why I wasn't able to spin up new 0.9 projects from Visual Studio. So check the release notes to make sure it's updated. So that's where you can kind of alleviate some of your troubleshooting pains. If you have things that are blowing up, the best thing to do is start with checking version numbers. and making sure you're on the latest bits for everything. So this project should compile just fine. We'll do Control F5. And when this guy spins up, it should work just fine. I don't expect to see any errors in here. The chat room seems like they've had some issues with the latest releases, so we'll see. Cross my fingers here, but I think this will work just fine. We haven't really done much yet but start up a new project, and we've got a brand new project, and it looks like it works just fine, which is great. We've got the usual counter, fetch data, and index page. Let's go ahead and close this solution thing out. We don't need the introduction anymore. And we can open our indexcshtml. So this interesting thing here is I'm noticing that we have .cshtml files still in the Blazor project. So I don't know why they haven't chose to use the Razer extension yet, but all of the pages in here are using the CSHTML. Just to kind of see if this actually works properly, let's try to change one of these to Razer, just to make sure. Let's see if we get any errors or anything like that. Let's do a Control Build, Control Shift B, do a rebuild, and it looks like everything's working fine. Let's do Control F5, give this guy a run in the browser, and it seems to be okay. So looks like the templates just haven't been updated yet, and it looks like either Razer or CSHTML work. So right now we can use either or. I don't know if that will change. I don't know if it's going to be a preference thing or how it's going to be handled, but .Razer does work now. It's just not given to us out of the box. So again, this is a preview, so those things will change pretty rapidly. Let's go ahead and start looking at some validation stuff. So we're probably going to need some data to model. Let's get the right blog post up here. And let's find the heading for improved event handling. It was right after that. Forms and validation. So we're going to use the obligatory person object. As any good demo should have, is a person object. So we need to create a class, and we'll just borrow theirs. So let's take this. So we need to create a person object. Let's create a folder. Add new folder. Let's call it models. That seems to be pretty well a pretty common convention to use. So we'll use that. And we'll do new item. So we'll create a new class of person. Brand new person. We'll paste in that code that was given to us in the example. And now we have a person and lots of red underscores. So what we don't have is our data annotations yet. So you can see we're trying to set up some validation, but that validation library isn't available, so we'll add a using statement to system.componentModel.dataAnnotations, and that's where all of our data annotations for a validation come from, and this is pretty common throughout the .NET ecosystem. What's really awesome is we can use this on a full stack application and only define it in one place and have it available everywhere. So that is amazing. I love it. No more of that, validation code in JavaScript, validation code in C# and trying to make sure those two things jive together. We can just define it one place and use it everywhere. So let's look at what kind of validations we have. Right now we've got required. What's cool about the component annotations here is we have, or data annotations is we have the ability to set error messages right in line. So we can say required, the error message for this required thing is going to be enter a name. We can do a length validation and say the name is too long. These are just demos, not by any means best practices. I don't think that is something that you would want to have in your app, but hey, we need to exercise validation somehow, so let's do a string length. Not too familiar with data annotations. I'm trying to remember if there's a minimum. Yeah, min length is also another one. So you could do min length. And you, again, best practice wise, you'd be very careful with these because people do have very short last names, or first names and last names. So I wouldn't go any further than saying at least has to be one character. And then you can set an error message for that. So that's how they work. You can see the overloads in here, the optional attributes or optional parameters as well. So we have things like error message. We can set a resource for the error message. So you could do localization and all those type of things. So let's set an error message in here. Localization would be an amazing show to have. I think it would probably take quite a while. Maybe that's more of a series of shows, but that would be something pretty big to tackle. I don't think the framework's quite ready for that yet, but it's something we could look at in the future. We can do range validation, which is very helpful. So you could set a range for an age. Someone did localization ages ago for Blazor, or for .NET in general. I don't know how you would do localization exactly on the client side yet. I just haven't looked into it, so I'm assuming that you can get some of the localization info off of the browser, and then use that to drive settings in your application. So required validator, again, you do not have to set an error message, so that it's nice to see that it's optional. And this one's doing a check to or a what do you call it? It's doing a type, so it's telling me it's going to be a range that is a Boolean value, and it's setting it to only accept true. So this is accept terms, and we can't submit unless we accept the terms with a true value here. So that's really cool because we can show that it's on a checkbox and handle those checkboxes. So the next thing we need to do is build the form for it. I'm sure we have some code in here. And we do. Here's an edit form. And we also have some code for it. We'll go ahead and copy the code as well. And we'll paste this in to our index page. Oh, so Chris, you have a NuGet package that grabs the culture info out of the browser settings. And you can use that. Well, that's awesome. That's definitely something that we could talk about on the show then, is how to do some basic localization. I always forget you don't get control period help inside of Razer markup, which kind of sucks. I'd really like to have that in here. It's probably something that's just difficult to add. So it hasn't been added. I'm sure they know that people would like that. This is also another reason I usually take this with a code behind approach, so I don't have to manually sit and type out using statements. So exploring validation dot models, that should give us person. So now, and we don't have to have the semicolon. So we've added our namespace for person. We're able to get a new person. And then if the click event, if we submit a valid event, so this is pretty cool. I guess you might want to call it syntactic sugar. We have an onValid submit event. So it only fires if there's a valid event. Yeah, please feel free to share that. Let me upgrade. I'm going to tell my bot here. I will anoint some mods in the channel today because I know you guys are frequent, very frequent viewers. And I can't do it for some reason. This chatbot is very annoying. I'm going to have to find a new one. This one never quite works the way I want it to. And it keeps telling me I'm not logged in, so I can't do the things I need to do to manage my chat room. So if you guys have, or Chris, if you have the name of that package, feel free to share it. And if it's blocking it, I'll just try to shut this chatbot down because it's annoying. There we go. Blazor localization. Yeah, this is chatbot's gonna have to go away. So hopefully that killed the chatbot. Chatbot is gone. And I'll have to do some research on chatbots because that one is it's supposed to be a good one and it's constantly just giving me trouble. All right, so back to data annotations. So this onValid submit thing is really handy because it gives me an event that only occurs on submission, a valid submission. So the validation's kind of wrapped inside of this already. So I don't have to worry about checking whether it was valid or not, which we normally do in like MVC. We do if the model has errors, if the model is valid, do such and such a thing. And this should essentially just work now. So I didn't read through this in depth, but I think that's the final step really. We can go ahead and run this now. I'm going to control F5. Again, there's still no real great debugging experience on the client side. And that's what I'm using right now is completely client-side Blazor. And now we have some kind of ugly text boxes here. Let's try to type a name. I think we had, let's see, what are some of our validations? We have required. So we can check required pretty easy. We'll just try to submit this. We have a string length. So we have a minimum and a maximum. We'll try to test those as well. Submit, must enter a name. So one worked. Let's actually up this to 2. So the minimum length has to at least be 2. So let's save that. Control F5. I want to make sure. What I'm trying to see is if we get a summary for multiple errors or not. We'll go ahead and run this guy. Now we can say, let's submit. Must have a name. Go ahead and just put 1. Name is too short, so that works. We can put up to 20 characters, and we're going to get name is too long. So that's pretty cool. So that works. Age in years. It can't be over 200, so we can try 250. Nope, that's too old. Let's see. So we'll do this. And accept terms. We have to accept the terms or it won't submit the form. So now we can do that, hit submit, and that would do something. I believe it's got a console log message in here, which if we go to console, onValid submit. So our validation is working. It's really easy to get running. I don't think they could have made it any easier. So hats off to the team on that one. Let's explore the onValid submit event just a little bit. First thing is, let's see. There is a, looks like there is an edit context that can come from this. Let's see what is in that. I don't know. Is that outlined in the blog post? What is in the edit context? It does. Form is defined. Using this sets up an edit context as a cascading value that tracks metadata about the edit process, what's been modified, current validation messages, etc. Huh. All right. So that, it looks like we can say event handlers is a, let's see, what was that called again? Edit context. So we can get an edit context in here, and we can say console. Oops, console.writeLine. That's always going to catch me, I think. When I'm on the client side, I want to say console.log so bad. And it's not, just not going to work. It's console.writeLine in .NET. So there is something called a model being passed through. We can call validate field. Let's see, what is this? I'm not sure what these things quite do. Is modified, mark is modified, notify field changed. Let's see what is in model. See what this gives us. Gets the model object from the edit context. And it looks like we'd probably have to cast this to something maybe. Don't know how useful this edit context is going to be. I don't know what exactly is in here. There's no docs yet, so it's kind of hard to figure out. Supplies a field identifier corresponding to the field name on the context model. I'd have to see how these are being used, or how they're intended to be used. Is modified is pretty interesting. We can do stuff with that. Get validation messages. That could be helpful. Let's see what's in here. Validation messages is an enumerable, so we could list these out. I don't think there would be any validation messages if it's successful. Those would be more something we'd handle on an invalid submission. So I think the values that are in the edit context are probably more valuable if we're doing something that isn't predetermined for us. So this is the onValid submit. So what we can also do with this, and this is really cool, is we can say on we can just say on submit, and this is something that would fire whether it's valid or not. So we can say handle submit, and this is going to fire all the time. And we can come in to our code and say handle submit, and then pass in the context. And it's probably more useful to us here, because we can check the context in here, and we can, let's see if I can figure this out. E dot is modified validate, and what does validate return? Yeah, validate is a function. We need to call it as a function, and that function returns true or false. So if validate is true or false, we can do something. Let's see, let's do a console WriteLine. We can see, so if it's in here, it's going to be a let's see, form is valid. So this would actually be the same as calling everything inside of this if block would be essentially like calling handle, or not handle, but we'd be calling on valid submit. From what I understand, this is pretty much the same idea. And then we could say this is always called. So it's always going to be called. So we have code that's going to run no matter what happens. And then let's go ahead and tack an else on here. And we can say else console dot write line form is invalid. So let's see if this will work out. So on valid submit only does just this one thing, where on submit gives us access to the full event, where we can manually decide how we want to do things. So there's some flexibility here. Let's give it a run, and we should be able to see those 3 console messages and how they work with the form. And it blew up, so I've got something wrong in here. So I've got 5. I've got console messages, but not the ones I was expecting. Unexpected, unhandled exception, rendering component, invalid operation, supply an on submit parameter to edit form, do not supply on valid or invalid submit. Okay, so you can only have one or the other apparently. So we need to get rid of this one. So that's kind of interesting. So we can only, from judging by that message, it looks like we either do one or the other. We can't do both. Let's give this a shot. You could bind success to a hidden div, like a thanks message. Okay, yeah. Definitely could do stuff like that. Let's see here. So now the form works. So now I've got 2 log messages. One is form is invalid and called always. So no matter what I do, that's going to be called. And I can make a valid form entry and then accept these terms and submit. And then I get form is valid and called always. So I've got multiple things that I can trigger based on whether the form is valid or not. So that's also very helpful, that I can handle invalid form submissions and valid form submissions based on the state of the form. And then I saw there is also an on invalid submit. So we could also do these individually. So I'm curious if I can do on invalid and on valid submit in the same go. So I couldn't do on submit and on valid submit. So I wonder if it'll let me do this. So let's put handle valid submit back in there. Let's change this one to handle invalid submit. So we can handle valid and invalid. I'll take out the called always stuff. Let's say on invalid submit. So now I've got 2 specialized event handlers, one for invalid and one for valid. Let's see if it'll take both of those. So it wouldn't let me do that before. So let's say submit, and then let's inspect. We should have the on invalid submit fired. And then, of course, we tested this one out earlier, and we've got on valid submit. So we can have invalid, we can have valid, or we can use neither of these and just use onSubmit. So it looks like they don't want you to use redundant event handlers. There could be some kind of collision or something, I suppose, where one is firing and invalidating another. So this, if you use onSubmit, you have full control over everything, or you can use those convenience methods and just do onValid or invalid. I like these because they're semantic. You know exactly what the event handler is going to do. It's going to handle an invalid submit. I really like that feature. I like things that read clearly, and that to me reads very clearly. So we've got data annotations validator. So what's interesting here is they specifically called this a data annotations validator, implying that you could have other validators. So you could have other validation providers, such as a Fluent validation validator. That's a mouthful. And then, of course, the validation summary, which shows the actual validation message. Let's see, I saw something else in here that is of interest. Let's go ahead and invalidate this again. We're seeing a red box around the name field, and I wonder how that is being done. So we have a validation errors thing. This is the validation summary. So that outputs a unordered list. So let's look back here. What validation summary does is it wraps a UL and list items. So this is what validation summary has underneath of it. Inside of the component, it's just iterating over the validation errors and listing them out. We've got an input text component, and it has a bind value, and somehow it understands how whether or not this is a valid input or not, and then it's drawing a red value around the text box. So it's actually adding a CSS class called invalid. It's also saying it's modified, which I think is interesting. So it's given a class modified and invalid. So let's see how it's doing that. From what I read, there's the edit form is using a cascading component, a cascading value that has the edit context in it. So that component can potentially subscribe to that. Maybe that is how how the input is working. These are built-in components. These components provide a default behavior for validating and change their CSS value. Validation message component. I didn't see a validation message component being used in this example. Did I miss it? So we have validation summary, but apparently we have a validation message component as well that we can tap into. Validation message component displays validation message for a specific field. Let's grab that and work with it for a second, and then we'll dive in and see if we can figure out how they wired up these input how they wired it up into the text, the input text. Chris says it's in the sample code and it's in the source code. So we should be able to use it here and say validation message. And for. And then we have to get a reference, I suppose, to the other. So it's a system, it's a func of t, which specifies the field. So how do we validation for, it accepts a function that tells it which field. So person.name, is that gonna give me what I need? Again, we're flying with no docs, so let's see if this does the trick. Some Razer magic there. Nope, got a build fail. Not quite sure what's required to satisfy this. Oh, okay, we do have to open a Lambda. Thanks, Chris. I was close, but no cigar. So we're just throwing an anonymous function in there, which would satisfy the action, or the func of t, rather. That compiled. So now let's put in 1. So there we go. Now we have a validation message of that name is too short. Let's try to find the source code for these inputs and validation, because I'd like to see how they're getting the context. In case we're creating a custom component and we want it to self-validate like this, we would need to know how this works. And let's see there. Cascading value and parameters, that just took me to the docs. They haven't documented this stuff yet, so we're gonna have to dive into GitHub and see how it's made. So if we go to GitHub, and it is under ASP.NET Core. Let's see if I've got it in my history. Yes, source components. I'm sure we can find. I'm sure we can find these components in here somewhere. Cascading events. Pre-render, where do you hide validation? Where are you? Forms. Validation message. So this is the validation message component. It's gonna be, let's see, we've got edit context, our field, and let's see, event handler, state changed event args, field identifier. Yeah, cascading parameter, edit context is the current edit context. So that's kind of web forms. There is a little bit of a web forms feel to that, but I get what you're saying. So this is kind of what I suspected by, they kind of alluded to it here in the release notes, that they are tying into a cascading value. So we have cascading parameter, edit context. This is going to look up the tree of components and find the current context for this component. So they are doing, there's no markup for this one. This just goes right to the render tree and builds dynamically. So it's a very simple component. It's just a div with a class on it. So they're going straight to a render tree here. So this bit of code, if you're new to Blazor, what it is saying in here is the same. It's effectively saying the same thing as div with a class. So it's generating a div with a class of validation message, and then setting the class value, or no, sorry, setting the message, the internal message of it. So instead of just writing this out in the CSHTML file, they just put it right into code. So that's what that bit of, let's see. Apologize if you guys have a hard time seeing this. I didn't bump my font size up today. Nobody let me know my font size was low. So that little bit of code, this render tree that's inside of the validation component, that's all that is they don't have an entire CSHTML file just for this little snippet. They're just rendering it directly out from the component itself, which is something that is easily done. It would have been compiled into that anyhow. So let's see what else we have in here that might be interesting. On parameter set is being used. So if there isn't an edit context, then it's going to throw a new exception telling you that you need to have one. So if I were to take out this form, so there's some validation logic, or not validation logic, but there is some error handling logic in here to tell me that if I try to do validation without wrapping it in some kind of form, this is going to throw when I run it. So we'll be able to see that message come up. Didn't even get that far, actually. Let's see, it's probably in the stack here. So, yep, there's that message. So, data annotations validator requires a cascading. So, I mean, hit the one for the component. I hit the top level one first. Cascading parameter value requires an edit context. For example, you can use the data annotations validator inside of an edit form. So there's some help in there. This is while it's necessary to be able to have that kind of error message, it's something that I'd like to see the compiler catch, or the IDE catch before the compiler does. But that's just not available yet. So having that message is helpful. So that's being done inside of that parameter set. See if there's any other goodies in here we can find. 4 can't be null, so we can't say that we can't set up a validator that doesn't have a target. And then let's see, 4 is not equal to field accessor. Not sure what that's for exactly. Current context is not equal to previous context. So this is just detecting a change. So detach validation state change listener. So a lot of stuff going on in here. I need to do a little bit of a deep dive to see what all's going on in here. So we should be able to make our own pretty easy if we see these. I'm sure they'll document how this stuff works pretty soon. We've got the various input components. We could take these as direction. Input text starts right off with a to-do in here. I'm wondering if they plan on to-do support max length. Not sure what that means. So let's see, these are setting up, these are just basic inputs. Validation message equals null. Not sure where these are getting their validation messages from. Oh, there's an input base. Okay, so they've done some inheritance here. So the validation is probably all in here. There's our cascading edit context. So there's a base component that this input base is the absolute base for everything. If we're using a plain form, then it will also fail. As in fail to validate, or fail as in compile, or runtime error. So it wouldn't fail to validate. It would fail at runtime because it's looking for a type. It's looking for a very specific type. Anything that has an edit context. So it must be inside of an edit context. Yeah, well, it would fail. It wouldn't fail to compile. It would fail at runtime. It'd be a runtime error. So just to kind of clarify what I mean, I think you understand what I mean, but in case there's somebody that's listening that's newer to .NET, if I said form, just a regular HTML form element, I'm not going to get a compilation error. So I can compile. I can Control-Shift-B, do a fresh compile. It's going to go through just fine. I'm not going to see an error here. I'm going to get a runtime error. So when I run it, this is just going to say loading and never finish. And inside of my console, I'm going to see this red hot mess, and then an invalid exception error. So it's going to throw because it doesn't have that type available. And the type is a edit context, which edit form is a descendant of an edit context. If we look at edit form, let's look at that next. So we see all these inputs are looking for this edit context. Where is that edit context coming from? If we look under form, edit form, just make sure it's not inheriting. It inherits from component base, so that's fine. We're not going to have like a base editor or whatever. Renders a form that cascades edit context. So this has an edit context as a parameter. So if you do a form, you would have to create an edit context and handle the wiring. Yes. So it would be a lot of work. It would be, I can tell you how much work exactly that would be, Lauren. It would be 139 lines of work. Because that's exactly what this is here. This is the edit form. So what this does is this generates a form tag. We can probably see that here. They're doing everything through the render tree just because it's they're not very complex components. They can just easily write them out in code. And they would get built into this anyway. So this is kind of like if you're coming from the JSX world, this is doing your just explicit JavaScript. Instead, we're just doing explicit C# here to create our components. So they're creating a form with an onSubmit, and it handles has a onSubmit handler. Has a couple other properties in here, and that gets built up. Then it has handle submit, and let's see, we've got our on valid and on invalid submit, on submit. These are all parameters. The edit context child content is just the this is just the child content between the two tags, the opening and closing form tags. This, all of anything in here, this body is going to be that edit or that child content. And then we've got our model, which is the data being passed in. Top level model object of the form. If using this parameter, do not also supply a value for edit context. So there's our model. There's where our model gets defined. And let's see. Let's see if we have any other goodies in here. And they're using this new event callback inside of their form. Again, this is replacing the action of T delegate. We're just doing some null checks in here on parameter set to make sure there's something here. Just throwing some errors if they're not. And then it looks like it's doing some change tracking here. So this is what's telling it if there's an edit that's been done, possibly. And handle submit will fire if the delegates are available. When it says here, when using on submit, the developer takes control of the validation lifecycle. This is where it's where I was trying to set multiple things. It said, no, you're going to use on submit, or you're going to use one of our helper methods. If it has a delegate, it's going to invoke on valid submit or invalid submit, whether so if the form is valid, it will invoke our method. If it is invalid, it will invoke our invalid method. So good stuff. It's not really terribly complex. So it's something that we could easily mimic if we wanted to create our own custom form or extend this one. There's some other helpers and things underneath here. Looks like they'd be handy. I don't know if we saw these field states in use. I don't know where those are used. They're probably used, let's see, they're outside of input components. I'm not quite sure there. They're probably inside the validation messages. Validation message store, expression extender. Just kind of curious, just poking around, see what's in here. I'm not sure what the store does. I guess there's it builds up one of these validation things. Let's see if it creates one from the model that isn't declared. Oh, was there a comment that says you can't build Razer files yet in the project? Huh. Edit context uses field state. Oh, okay, so it's all part of the edit context. I didn't see it in there. Okay, yeah, field changed. So all the building blocks for validation are right here. This is just a few files. There's not a lot of code in each one. If we needed to take advantage of validation in a custom component, doesn't look like it'd be terribly complex to do that. Excuse me, hiccups now. All right. So kind of a deep dive into validation there, but it's very cool stuff. We've got validation messages that we can tack onto things. If you have something that validates and you want to modify the class for it, it looks like it needs to be baked into the component. Doesn't look like something that we can just tack on. You could possibly do that through tracking the state of. Wonder if we could do that. One thing that's trying to think how we might be able to do this. If you didn't have access to a component and you wanted to set like a CSS class on it, I'm trying to think through how you might be able to do that. One thing you could possibly do is just create a variable that why edit form? Yeah. Probably because form is a reserved HTML keyword, so you don't want to just call it form. So it's just kind of like, what do we name it? So I'll try to explain what I was thinking about there, Mr. Magoo. If I have some type of input that's not a standard input that's covered here, let's say I just want to do a regular old input, and I want some type of class to be my error CSS class. How would I go about setting this on or off based on the state of the model in here? So this input handles it internally. If I had some kind of custom thing and I didn't have access to coloring it in an invalid error way, how would I tack a class on? Or even if I had some input that let's say I have my component and it comes from some type of library, and I want to change the CSS of it based on whether there's validation or not. I suppose I could wrap it in a div, but then I need some way to toggle a CSS class to say it's invalid. So I was kind of thinking about that scenario, where it's nice to have these things that are baked in and automatically like highlight themselves. But what if I have something I've pulled in as a dependency? Maybe I don't have access to it. How would I change the CSS class of that component? So one thing I might be able to do is tap into, you could do a custom edit context. You could also possibly say when I submit, you could even do it on valid or invalid. I don't know if you could catch which thing is making it valid. So what I could say is, I could say that the form is valid. Let's start with a true. Just thinking outside the box. There probably could be a better way to do this. I don't know. But I could say is valid equals false. And I could get into how maybe we could check the actual field that's causing it later. And again, this is if you don't have access to the component to build it yourself. If the component was something you own, you'd want to have a cascading value from the edit context. If you don't have access to it, I'm just thinking maybe this would be a way. And you could say at is, whoops, sorry, this is going to be is valid if it's valid, then we can set a class if we want to. If it's not valid, say is invalid, or we could say error is probably easier. Something like that. So we could toggle a value there. Or we would have to really custom do something. Let's see. They covered all the basic inputs though. I'm just trying to think outside the box. I'm probably making more problems than I need to. Trying to think of something that would be custom but not covered under what's already there. Let's just do I know there's already a checkbox, but let's just say input equals type equals checkbox. And even though it's not throwing it, we'd have to check to make sure it is the thing that's throwing it. So I guess by that point, you would just be writing something completely custom, because you have to see if it's the thing that's causing the error or not. It would have to be aware. It'd have to be in those checks and balances to see if it's valid or invalid. Probably overthinking it. Probably just need to do it correctly. Radio buttons. Yeah, radio buttons. Yeah, it'd be easier just to create a correctly implemented component than to go through all of that to kind of tack it on at the end. It has to be part of the validation lifecycle and then set its own validation state and all that. Best thing to do would probably be just to throw the validation message on it. Another thing that might be interesting is, well, no, that's still going to be in the life cycle. It still has to have something to check it. Well, anyhow, what we could do though, if you wanted, if you wanted to tap into any of, say you wanted to show like a red box around the entire form that's invalid, you could just tap into the events and set it on and off. Yeah, Mr. Migu, that'd probably be it. You'd have to just make. I was trying to see if there was a quick way to do it. There's not. You just have to wrap it, just like you said. Create a cascading parameter. Just wrap it. Wrap that component and call it something new. I think a good example was radio buttons. You'd have to have like radio button with validation capabilities. So wrap the radio buttons inside of a component that has a cascading parameter that grabs the context from the parent. That would work. So you'd have to do a custom, little bit of a custom component, but it looks like we have the building blocks to make that pretty easy. So good stuff. Let's take a look at, I think we about covered validation in depth. Unless anybody has a question about validation I didn't try to cover. I think I may have gone a little